the children of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette of France had 4 offspring. They also adopted 6 orphans. These children spent their early years in the lap of luxury at the Palace of Versailles, but the French Revolution tore the family apart. The king and queen lost their heads to Madame Guillotine, and the children were imprisoned and scattered to the wind. Let's meet the children of the King and Queen of France. At the age of 15, the sweet and naive 15th child and youngest daughter of Holy Roman Empress Maria Theresa traveled to France to wed the heir to the throne. After a dazzling wedding, the couple were escorted to their bedroom by the entire court, placed under the blankets, blessed by a cardinal, and told to be fruitful and multiply. They did not, and in fact failed to consummate their marriage for a further 7 years. The couple were mismatched. Marie was vivacious and loved a party, while Louis was serious, dull, and completely innocent about sex. He preferred to spend his time in his rather ironic hobby of lockmaking. Louis's grandfather, King Louis XV, a famous philanderer, died in 1774, and the 19-year-old couple became King and Queen of France. Marie was miserable at Versailles. She was homesick and hated the rigid formality and traditions of court. She drowned her sorrows by indulging in expensive gowns, hairstyles, parties, and gambling. Her decadent lifestyle added to the nation's resentment of her. She was blamed for failing to produce a future king, which was seen as her primary duty. One day, while the queen was out riding in her carriage, the horse nearly trampled a 5-year-old peasant boy. The coachman rescued him without injury. His grandmother rushed out of a nearby cottage to take him. "Is his mother alive?" asked the queen. "No, madame. My daughter died last winter and left 5 small children upon my hands." The queen insisted that destiny had sent the child to console her until she should have the happiness of her own child. Marie offered to adopt the boy and provide for his siblings. The grandmother eagerly agreed, but warned, "Jacques is a bad boy. I hope he will stay with you." The queen took little Jacques on her knee and told the driver to ride on. But on the journey, Jacques screamed and kicked the queen and her ladies. He was not at all pleased to have been adopted by royalty and pined for his family. But Marie spoiled the handsome boy. The queen changed his name to the more sophisticated Armand Gagné. Armand ate breakfast with the king and queen every day, and Marie lavished caresses upon him. But Armand remained resentful of his adoptive mother. 7 years after Marie and Louis's wedding, Marie's older brother, Joseph, came for a visit. He wanted to figure out why the King and Queen of France had not yet produced an heir. After questioning his brother-in-law, Joseph wrote that they were a couple of complete blunderers. Once Louis was given instruction and possibly a circumcision to relieve the painful condition of phimosis, Marie became pregnant. On December 19, 1778, 200 courtiers and officials crowded into the queen's bedchamber to watch her give birth. Such public deliveries were tradition. There needed to be plenty of witnesses to confirm that the queen did indeed deliver a living child. The room was so crowded that Marie fell unconscious and nearly died of suffocation. But a courtier flung open the windows to allow in fresh air and revive Her Majesty. After the horrific event, Louis only allowed a handful of trusted courtiers to attend the deliveries of the rest of his children. When Marie gained consciousness, she was delighted to greet her firstborn child, Marie-Thérèse. There was some disappointment that the long-awaited child was female, as French law barred women from the line of succession. But her mother proclaimed, "Poor little one, you are not desired, but you will be none the less dear to me." A son would have belonged to the state. You will belong to me. She was named Marie-Thérèse, the French version of her maternal grandmother's name, Holy Roman Empress Maria Theresa, and Charlotte, the nickname of her mother's favorite sister, Maria Carolina, Queen of Naples and Sicily. As the king's eldest daughter, she was styled Madame Royale. Her adoring mother called her Mousseline after a sweet cream sauce. Louis delighted in spoiling his daughter. Marie Antoinette was determined that her children would not grow up to be haughty. She often invited children of lower rank to play with Marie-Thérèse and encouraged her to give her toys to the poor. Marie Antoinette's second pregnancy ended in miscarriage. Her third resulted in the birth of a long-awaited son and heir, Louis Joseph. He was born on October 22, 1781. France rejoiced at the birth of a dauphin. Louis Joseph was named for his father and the 15 previous Louis who had ruled over France, and after his maternal uncle, Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II, whose intercession had ensured his conception. Louis Joseph did well in his studies and was praised for his intelligence. Marie Antoinette adored her children and was a devoted mother, but royal protocol prevented her from caring for them on a day-to-day basis. They were handed off to governesses and wet nurses. But whenever the queen was able, she took them to her private retreat, Le Petit Trianon, where she could lavish affection upon them in an informal and intimate setting. Marie Antoinette became pregnant for a fourth time, but on her 28th birthday, she suffered a miscarriage. A few months later, she rekindled a friendship with a dashing Swedish army officer, Count Axel von Fersen, who had just returned from fighting in the American Revolution. Axel was a frequent guest at Petit Trianon, and there is strong speculation that he and the queen were lovers. Evidence is inconclusive, and most of the letters between them were destroyed. However, in one recently discovered letter, Axel tells the queen, "I love you madly, and there is never a moment in which I do not adore you." Axel also wrote to his sister that he could never marry because his one true love was already taken. On March 27, 1785, exactly 9 months after Axel's return to France, Marie gave birth to Louis Charles. Many speculated that the new prince was fathered by the Swedish count. The Libelles, 18th century tabloids, took every opportunity to slander the already unpopular queen. They claimed that all of her children were illegitimate. They also published outlandish claims of Her Majesty's sexual deviance, including lesbianism with her female friends and orgies at the palace. Most historians now believe that Louis Charles was indeed fathered by King Louis. The prince was named Louis after his father, and Charles, like his older sister, after his mother's favorite sister, Charlotte. He was granted the title Duke of Normandy. 15 months later, on July 9, 1786, Marie gave birth to her final child, Sophie. She was named after a paternal aunt who had recently died. Sophie was born prematurely. She was a large baby, but her health was fragile. The queen sat for this portrait with her 4 children, but shortly after its completion, baby Sophie was painted out. At 11 months, she suffered from convulsions for 5 days and then died, probably from tuberculosis. The king and queen were heartbroken. A courtier tried to console the grieving mother by informing her that as the baby had died young, she must not have grown overly attached. Marie answered back, "Don't forget that she would have been my friend." Sophie was buried in the royal crypt at the Basilica of Saint-Denis. To ease her heartache, the queen adopted 5 additional children. Jean Amilcar was born in Senegal on the west coast of Africa, at the time a French colony. He was enslaved and at the age of 6 was taken to France and presented to the Queen as a gift. Marie set Jean free, adopted him, and had him baptized. Jeanne did not live at the palace with Marie's other children, but instead she paid for him to attend boarding school. Ernestine Lambriquet was the daughter of a palace servant and chambermaid. She had been selected as a playmate for Princess Marie-Thérèse when the girls were a few months old. Ernestine bore a resemblance to King Louis, and there were rumors that she was his illegitimate daughter, though there is no evidence of an affair between the king and her mother. When the girls were 10, Ernestine's mother died, and she was adopted by the king and queen. She slept in the same room as Marie-Thérèse, dressed in the same clothes, ate the same food, and was educated by the same governess. Zoe Jeanne Louise Victoire was also the daughter of 2 servants in the royal household. When she was 3, she and her 2 older sisters were orphaned. Jeanne was the same age as Louis Charles, and Marie Antoinette decided to adopt her as a companion for her son, like Marie-Thérèse had Ernestine. The queen gave her a new name, Zoe. She also paid for her older sisters to attend a convent school. Eldest son and heir Louis Joseph had been suffering frequent fevers from the age of 3. He was taken to Château de la Muette in the hopes that fresh air would improve his health. At 5, the prince's education was officially handed over to male tutors. At the ceremony, he had trouble walking, caused by a curvature of the spine, and he was made to wear a metal corset to correct it. The Dauphin's fevers were in fact the first signs of tuberculosis of the spine. When the fatal illness was finally diagnosed, his wet nurse was blamed for transmitting the disease to him. Louis Joseph died on June 4, 1789, at the age of 7½. His heartbroken parents buried him next to his baby sister Sophie. His younger brother, Louis Charles, thus became the Dauphin and heir to the throne. The terrible blow of Louis Joseph's death came when the king and queen were already in dire straits. Several costly wars, a large and expensive royal family, and the aristocracy and clergy's refusal to relinquish their privileges had put France in serious financial trouble. The peasants were suffering, and they blamed the king and especially the queen for their woes. Louis Joseph died just a few days after they had been forced to call the Estates General, the elected legislature of France, which had not been convened since 1614. They were tasked with figuring out a way forward. The Third Estate, representing the common people, wanted to reform the country, but they met only resistance from the royals and clergy. Fed up, they walked out and formed a national assembly. Paris was besieged by riots that culminated in the storming of the Bastille prison on July 14, 1789. The mob released prisoners and seized weapons and ammunitions and began the French Revolution. In October, bread shortages compelled a mob of women to march to Versailles. Their target was Queen Marie Antoinette. They stormed the palace and destroyed the queen's bedchamber, but she and her children had hidden in the king's room. By the time they found the royals, the mob had calmed down enough not to kill them, but they did force them to come back to Paris. The mob carried the heads of their slain Swiss guards on pikes before them. The royal family's imprisonment also changed the lives of the queen's adopted children. In the madness of the mob attack, Armand abandoned the family. He joined up with the Revolutionary Army against his adoptive parents. He was killed in battle in 1792, age 21. Ernestine and Zoe accompanied their adoptive siblings to the Tuileries Palace, where they were kept prisoner. At first, they were all treated gently. The children were allowed to continue their education with a governess, and the queen spent as much time as she was allowed with her children. After a year of imprisonment, the Queen sent Zoe to boarding school with her sisters. Marie kept up tuition payments for the Victoire sisters and for Jeanne Amilcar as long as she could, but eventually the revolutionaries put a stop to it. When the tuition money dried up, the Queen's adopted children were turned out of their schools. It is unknown what became of 5-year-old Zoe Victoire or her sisters. Jean was 11. One of his teachers took him in and continued his education. He had a talent for drawing, and at 15, he was accepted to an art academy in Paris with a scholarship, but he died of illness that same year. Ernestine remained with the royal family the longest, but after 2 years of imprisonment and being forced to publicly swear loyalty to the revolution, the royals decided to make a run for it. They fled in a carriage overladen with luggage, including a full silver dinner service and a wine chest. Slowed down by the weight, they crawled through the French countryside. A peasant recognized the king from his image on a coin and called a mob to seize the family and take them back to Paris. The attempted escape obliterated what little remaining support they had. Another angry mob stormed the Tuileries Palace and threatened to murder the royal family. They were taken to the Tower of the Temple, the ruins of a medieval fortress. In these far less luxurious accommodations, they were held under constant scrutiny. Guards were posted in their rooms 24 hours a day, and the royals were frequently searched for smuggled letters. The Queen's health deteriorated and her hair turned white. She instructed 14-year-old Marie-Thérèse to bid farewell to her lifelong friend and adopted sister, Ernestine. She asked the royal governess to take Ernestine away to safety. While they were making their escape, a revolutionary mistook Ernestine for the princess and threw the corpse of a Swiss guardsman at her. A shopkeeper defended her, also believing she was Marie-Thérèse. Ernestine's father was guillotined for his loyalty to the crown. She changed her name to Marie Philippine to avoid being sent to the guillotine as well. She survived the revolution and married, but died of an unknown cause at age 35. On September 21, 1792, the French monarchy was abolished. The remaining children were no longer Dauphine of France and Madame Royale, but Louis Charles and Marie-Thérèse Capet. In December, their father was taken away. They would never see him again. He was found guilty of high treason and guillotined on January 21, 1793. In the eyes of royalists and foreign powers, Louis Charles became King Louis XVII. His uncle, the Count of Provence, who had escaped to Germany, declared himself the young king's regent. 7-year-old Louis Charles was taken from his family. His horrified mother physically fought the guards who came to claim him. The former queen spent hours each day trying to catch a glimpse of her son. He was placed under the guard of a cobbler, Anton Simon. Marie-Thérèse wrote of the monster Simon in her memoir. She could hear her brother's cries and screams from her room. Stories of Simon's cruelty to the former prince were whispered by foreign spies. It was said that in addition to regular beatings, Louis Charles was forced to swear, drink alcohol to excess, and that prostitutes were brought in to molest him in order to infect him with venereal disease. Revolutionaries may have instructed these abominable acts in an attempt to fabricate evidence against the Queen. They forced Louis Charles to sign a document swearing that his own mother had sexually abused him. This fit in perfectly with the many accusations of depravity the Queen had faced over the years and the horrendous public image which had been crafted for her. The next day, Louis Charles was allowed to see his sister. It would be the last time they ever met. The Dauphin was handed off to new guards who walled him up in a prison cell, Food was handed to him through the bars, and he lived in his own filth. He was allowed no human contact or daylight for 6 months. This had a severe psychological impact on him. Finally, Paul Barras, a leader of the revolution, came to visit Louis. He was appalled by the boy's treatment and demanded that he be bathed and redressed. His room was cleaned, and during the day he was visited by a new attendant who took him out for walks on the roof of the tower. Marie Antoinette was taken away from her daughter and put on trial. She was stoic while her many crimes, real or imagined, were volleyed at her. But when her son was forced to testify that she had molested him, Marie protested. She appealed to all the mothers present that no mother could commit such an act. She elicited some sympathy, but nonetheless was found guilty of treason. Marie Antoinette was guillotined on October 16, 1793. She was 37 years old. Louis Charles was so distraught at having spoken against his beloved mother that he never uttered a word again. He died on June 8, 1795, at the age of 10, in the arms of one of his jailers. His official cause of death was tuberculosis, the disease which had cost the lives of his older brother and younger sister back at Versailles. But the abuse and neglect he suffered undoubtedly caused his ill health. The doctor who performed his autopsy noted that his body was covered with scars. The boy who would be king was buried in an unmarked pauper's grave in Paris. His heart was smuggled out during the autopsy and was passed around noble families for centuries. In 2000, the mummified heart was confirmed through DNA to have belonged to Louis Charles. In 2004, it was buried in the crypt of the Saint-Denis Basilica, near the graves of Louis's parents and siblings. The only child to survive the revolution was Marie-Thérèse. She was 14 when her mother was guillotined. For 9 months, she was cared for by her aunt Elizabeth. But in July of 1794, during the Reign of Terror, Elizabeth was also taken away and guillotined. Marie-Thérèse was told that her father was dead, but not what became of the other family members who had been ripped from her arms. She was allowed only 2 books, a prayer book, The Imitation of Christ, and Voyages by L'Harpe, which she read over and over. She begged for more books, but was ignored. She scratched in the wall of her cell, "Marie-Thérèse Charlotte is the most unhappy person in the world. She can obtain no news of her mother, nor be reunited with her, though she has asked it 1,000 times. Live, my good mother, whom I love well. O my Father, watch over me from heaven above." When the terror came to an end, a sympathetic female attendant told Marie-Thérèse what had become of her mother, brother, and aunt. She let out loud sobs of anguished grief. On December 18, 1795, the eve of her 17th birthday, Marie-Thérèse was liberated. She was exchanged for a number of French prisoners and sent to Vienna, her mother's birthplace, to live at the court of her cousin, Holy Roman Emperor Francis II. She later joined the Comte de Provence, her father's younger brother, who had claimed the title King Louis XVIII. Louis didn't have any children of his own, so he asked Marie-Thérèse to marry his nephew, her own cousin, Louis Anton, Duc d'Angoulême. The union would improve Louis Anton's claim to the French throne, should the chance ever arise. Louis Anton was a shy, stammering man. The couple never had any children. The family moved to Great Britain, where they were granted grace and favor lodgings at Hartwell House, Buckinghamshire. Following the Revolution, General Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power and crowned himself Emperor of France in 1804. He wanted to conquer the rest of the world, but in 1814 he was defeated by other European superpowers and exiled to the island of Elba. Not wishing to return to the bloody days of the Republic, France invited the Bourbon family to restore the monarchy. 21 years after the execution of Louis XVI, King Louis XVIII was crowned in France. Marie-Thérèse found the return to the country of her family's demise incredibly distressing. She distrusted everyone around her. Over 100 men claimed to be Louis Charles and told tales of having escaped imprisonment and death. Some attempted to get Marie-Thérèse to collaborate their stories, greatly upsetting her. She visited her parents' paupers' graves and had their remains exhumed and given a royal burial in Saint-Denis Basilica, the resting place of centuries of French kings. In 1815, Napoleon escaped his island prison and retook France. Louis XVIII fled, but Marie-Thérèse rallied troops in Bordeaux. Napoleon ordered her arrest, and not wanting to send her loyal soldiers into pointless bloodshed, she gave up and left the country. Napoleon said that she was the only man in her family. After 100 days back in power, Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo and sent to the island of St. Helena, from which he would never escape. The Bourbon dynasty was restored for a second time, and Louis XVIII returned. But not everyone was happy to have the monarchy back. Louis Antoine's younger brother, Charles, was stabbed to death while leaving the opera. There were very few members of the Bourbon family left, and it looked like if they managed to survive the wrath of their people, the dynasty might die out on its own for lack of heirs. But Charles's wife, Marie Caroline, discovered that she was pregnant. Her son, Prince Henri, was hailed as a miracle baby. Louis XVIII died in 1824, and his younger brother became King Charles X. Marie-Thérèse's husband was now heir to the throne, and she became Madame la Dauphine. King Charles refused to compromise with the working and middle class. He purged the government of former revolutionaries and supporters of Napoleon. In July 1830, armed demonstrators flooded the streets of Paris to protest the king and his son. Charles X was forced to sign abdication papers. This made Louis Antoine King Louis XIX and Marie-Thérèse Queen of France. Their glorious reign lasted only 20 minutes, until Louis was also forced to sign abdication papers. Marie-Thérèse begged him not to sign, but he had no choice. Their 9-year-old cousin was next in line and became Henri V. Distant cousin Louis-Philippe, Duc d'Orléans, was far more popular with the people, and he forced Henri to abdicate and hand the throne to him. He was King Louis-Philippe I for 18 years, until yet another revolution in 1848 toppled him and France became a republic for good. Out of power once more, Marie-Thérèse and her family left France. They lived on the favor of sympathetic royals in Scotland, Prague, and Italy. Marie-Thérèse nursed her uncle father-in-law as he died of cholera. After her husband died, she moved into a castle outside Vienna, where she spent her days taking walks, reading, sewing, and praying. Her nephew, the former King Henri V, and now claimant to the Bourbon throne, and his sister lived with her. Marie-Thérèse died of pneumonia in 1851, age 72. She was buried next to her husband in a Franciscan monastery in Gorz, modern-day Slovenia. Her gravestone reads, Queen Dowager of France. Want even more tea on history? Check out the History Tea Time podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and check out my other royal history videos. If you really want to help, please consider supporting me on Patreon. A link is in the description. Thank you for watching.